I think it's afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for not being Capetonian and staying in bed where there's just a little bit of rain, which is something that I gathered from people that come from the place. What we have this week is centered around 4 themes, but those 4 themes are directly related to our 4 key priorities. So every day I actually mention this, so that we are very aware of the fact that these things are intentional and that they are strategic. So the first theme, and this the key priority that you'll get from our IOP 2016 to 2020, embedded in goal 2, which is the learning and teaching goal, is on academic excellence and student success. And therefore we had a very robust discussion, and as you would have seen on the website also, Nicholas did a nice write-up of this. Dr. Sue Pather and Dr. Vanessa Brown led the discussions around student retention and success, as well as our new model for first day experience. Very exciting things happening there. And you would find that throughout the week we have the suggestion box here, because we would like to have your ideas as to how a lot of these things that we're talking about, that we're all serious about, we put them into practical action. And they had various levels of completion. So that was Tuesday. The second key priority for us is about research-led learning and teaching. It's also intentional that we made the link that it's not learning and teaching or research, but that we research-led in our approach. And there are 2 legs to that. That's the how do we, and that's why yesterday was interesting also. Prof. Davis Coleman is the driver of Project Y, which is around really in how do we enhance the critical thinking skills and research skills of our undergraduate students that will prepare them better for postgraduate study, or even to have those kind of skills for the workplace if they do need before postgraduate study. So that was yesterday. And yesterday we also released this, and which is the reflections of both the project leader as well as a mentor, and then about 6 winning essays. The reflections by the students themselves of their critical thinking and research skills journey at UWC, but bearing in mind their own background. So it's actually very interesting to read this. And so we come to today. All of these, in fact, I missed one. Number 3 is actually the university in the digital age. But what we've done was to ask the question, so what do we do about the 4th industrial revolution? And that was unpacked on Monday. Very well, CHS was really in the center of that, and particularly things such as AR/VR, which falls also under our multimodal pedagogies and literacies, AR/VR in the classroom. So that was very interesting on Monday as well. And then so we come to today. This is actually my own EPICS project, which deals with the UWC intellectual identity. So there's been a whole process of the last while to engage both with students and staff on campus, but also I've had a lot of you might have seen on the website the engagements with the alumni to get the alumni voice in this as well. And in the last one, which was last week, on the 6th of September, we had a big one here in the main hall, and I added something to the questions for conversation at the table. And we got all the feedback from every table and every individual sitting there, because it's also part of the research project that we're doing. So where we analyze the inputs that we've been receiving. And we asked the alumni, if you think of the historical intellectual identity, what do we garner from that into the future? What should the future UWC intellectual identity be? And most importantly for us, what are the key principles that they feel strongly enough should be retained for the UWC curriculum, because we want to have a set of first principles, and I'll come back to this when we look at the way forward after the discussion. So the idea this year was that the conversations would go into faculties. and that it would also include the issues that, especially when the student protests came to the fore, decolonization, Africanization, internationalization also in a sense, but today we're focusing on decolonization of the curriculum and what would it mean for the different disciplines? What does it mean for a start? Because we also have different conceptual thinking around this. And therefore we have 4 speakers today, and I'm going to ask them to come to the front. Somehow, I don't know how we got the gender balance so wrong, but we'll excuse them for today, okay? We'll make up for the gender balance because normally in learning and teaching, we're totally female. So Professor Jacques Deville, our Dean of Law, will be first, but I will ask you to come and sit here as the eminent panel.
We need to see the presentation.
You want to see the presentation? Okay, that's fine. You will be first. And then next up we'll have Professor Matthew Auckland from EMS, Deputy Dean Academic Planning at EMS. And then third up would be Professor Antoine Bakula, and he's also leading this with Dr. Marky Jenkins' AR/VR immersive technologies things. And then the last would be Professor Chetty from probably one of our newer appointees in the Faculty of Education that's done quite a bit of work in this field. What we want to have is they will give an input, and we would like to have your input. So what we're going to hand out are these cards. We are interested in what you say, so even if you don't say it here, please jot down your input, and then we'll put it in the suggestion box and take it into the process going further. So I'm going to ask, without any further ado, Professor Deville to deliver his input. Would you like the other mic? Would you like that one?
Thank you, Professor Lavac. I'm afraid I'm the default guy, so it was actually Professor LaRue who was supposed to speak today, but he's in the United States, and so I'm just standing in for him. Right, so I'm basically going to speak about the Council of Higher Education and the accreditation of our LLB program, which we worked on from the beginning of this year. So the Council on Higher Education laid down an LLB qualification standard in May 2015. Professor Lavac was also involved in that while she was still a law dean, against which law faculties programs were evaluated or measured between 2016 and 17. This is what the standard said about transformation, about transformative constitutionalism. It required of law faculties to ensure that their programs place transformative constitutionalism at the forefront of the curriculum. It did not say anything about decolonization. So perhaps if we can read the first one there, the first few lines, the South African Constitution is transformative in nature. Our constitutional democracy seeks to transform our legal system, its foundational values of human dignity, achievement of equality and the advancement of human dignity, of human rights and freedoms, introduce a new ethos that should permeate our legal system. That's a quotation from the Constitutional Court, and therefore legal education cannot be divorced from transformative constitutionalism. So transformative constitutionalism was at the heart of, one can say, of this whole LLB review. It was in the preamble, the standard which all LLB programs needed to comply with. Now, the notion of transformative constitutionalism was popularized by the United States critical legal scholar Carl Clare in an article that he published in the South African Journal of Human Rights in 1998. And he argues there in favor of a change in the legal culture in South Africa, away from formalism meaning that rules or laws can only be interpreted in one way, so one rule or rule has a specific outcome, to one where the law or the constitution is understood as open to different political interpretations, and that one has a choice, and the choice that he exercised as a progressive critical legal scholar is that the Constitution, the South African Constitution, should be interpreted in a way that brings about democratic, participatory and large-scale egalitarian social change, rather than it be interpreted in a liberal, conservative or free market way. Right, so kind of a social democratic interpretation of the Constitution is what he argued for. We know that in 2015 and 16, the roads must fall and fees must fall protests happened, and this brought the issue of decolonization to the forefront. So when the law faculty's programs were reviewed in 2016 and 17, the issue of decolonization was also picked up by the Council of Higher Education, by the panels, and they, in commenting on the self-evaluation reports of the different faculties, they suggested and recommended that all the law faculties should review their LLB curricula, and that they should pay attention not only to transformative constitutionalism, but also to decolonization. And so the question arises, what is the relation between these two, transformative constitutionalism and decolonization? Now, the draft report of the Council of Higher Education on the LLB review, this draft was finished last year in November. The deans got sight of it in January this year, and the report, the final report, is now done, but we haven't seen it yet. But that report, this is a draft one, refers to decolonization and transformative constitutionalism as, in essence, two sides of the same coin. So we can perhaps read that together. It says the national imperative to decolonize higher education curricula, an exercise that is currently underway at higher education institutions, is closely related, that's a central term, closely related to the imperative articulated in the LLB standard that transformative constitutionalism be embedded in the LLB curricula and internalized by staff and students. Decolonization speaks to an imperative to transform the LLB curriculum and the teaching and learning content of applicable modules in a manner that, while ever mindful of constitutional norms and principles, steers a clear path between the need to Africanize the curriculum and the need to educate students on the globalized environment within which law is practiced. African-based themes in an African context must permeate law teaching far more than is currently the case, but in a way that does not neglect the importance of maintaining a global perspective on national and international law. Right, so that's the interpretation then of the CHE, that decolonization and transformative constitutionalism are not really that far apart. Now, in the law faculty, at the beginning of the year, we had to debate our new curriculum, suggest a new draft curriculum, and the engagement with these issues were a little more complex and critical, one can say, than what one finds here in the Council of Higher Education report. So it was, for example, pointed out in the discussions that this version of decolonization is perhaps not a very radical interpretation. There are more radical interpretations of decolonization which reject the whole idea of transformative constitutionalism. Because the argument is that the Constitution failed to address the issue of colonization. It only addressed the issue of apartheid. So in other words, it did not address the land issue specifically. And therefore, if the curriculum only focuses on transformative constitutionalism, it would not really lead to social justice. And so transformative constitutionalism, in this view, is seen as not being radical enough. Questions were also raised in the discussions about the politically neutral nature and controversiality, one can say, of the notion of transformative constitutionalism. And there's no doubt that looking at the scholar who originally propagated it, Carl Clare, is a United States critical legal scholar, as I said, so he's a left thinker on the left. And so he also would acknowledge that transformative constitutionalism is politically loaded. It's a left program. Now perhaps I must point out that this criticism of the notion of transformative constitutionalism in the law faculty did not come from politically conservative sides, but mostly from a Marxist perspective. And the argument here is that law is not as important as transformative constitutionalists think, that changes in society come about not necessarily only through law, but more through activism and social protest and so on, and that transformative constitutionalism thinks that law is more important than it actually is. One can also raise theoretical questions about the fairly superficial engagement with the notion of politics or the political by critical legal scholars, but we don't need to go into that perhaps today. So the Council of Higher Education also in 2017 released a document on decolonization and the curriculum, and it pointed out there that the call to decolonize the curriculum can be understood in 4 senses, as you see there. And the faculty, because of time constraints, decided to focus on the first 2 issues, the content of the curriculum, what is taught and how it is taught. So in relation to the first bullet point then, the question of what is taught, this document of the Council of Higher Education points out, for example, that it needs to be relevant within the local context. So the focus of the curriculum should be on the developmental challenges of South African society. So the curriculum should focus on issues like urbanization, the housing crisis, alleviating poverty, access to land, addressing inequality, and the inclusive development of the economy. And this, of course, such an understanding would be very close to the notion of transformative constitutionalism. But as I said, this idea was not accepted by all in the faculty. Some people felt uncomfortable with aligning the whole curriculum with a program for social change. And so what was accepted in the faculty, one can say in a fairly broad sense, was that the curriculum needs to reflect African cultures and realities. So with the use of examples in class, illustrations, comparisons, and so on, these need to be African-centered, and this is what was broadly accepted in the faculty in the end. So it was left to departments and to individual faculty members then to look, with reference to a few guidelines that I will give you now, to what extent their own module and the modules within the department, to which extent they can be said to be decolonized. And the guidelines that we adopted, one can say, are the ones that you see there on the slide. So this is what a module should typically include, a module that is decolonized. But of course it depends a lot on not only the theoretical perspective of the specific lecturer, but also the specific module. So different modules lend themselves more or less so to decolonization than others. Right, so I'm not going to read all of that in the interest of time. Just coming to the second bullet point, how it is taught. That was also one of the central issues. So in the law faculty's curriculum review document, it is noted that at stake in how the curriculum is taught is the issue of a non-alienating learning experience. And then it continues to say what you see there: alienation results when knowledge is imposed on students rather than co-constructed. The decolonization of the curriculum implies a different understanding of the student, not as a passive recipient of knowledge, but as an agent of his or her own learning. The student is no longer the passive colonial subject, but engages in knowledge production and learning as an active citizen. This is something that's also reflected in the faculty's strategic plan. With regard to active learning, it notes that this notion builds on the understanding that learning takes place in a variety of ways and through a variety of modes, both inside and outside the classroom. Learning, in other words, does not only take place in contact sessions, which requires the conceptualization and development of learning and teaching material for non-contact time. The notion of active learning can be promoted through the innovative and creative use of information and communication technology appropriate for the 21st century graduate. Right, so to conclude, just perhaps a few notes on the new curriculum. We're still in the process of finalizing it, hopefully for implementation in 2020. And you see there, for example, the module Law in Context. That would be a first-year module, and the idea there would be to look at some of these concepts and values like transformative constitutionalism, decolonization, Africanization, globalization, digitalization, and so on, to define them and to make students understand what these issues are about, and also, of course, to have their input. And then in the third year, whereas customary law is now a first-year subject, the idea is to make it a third-year subject, so it gets a bit more importance. And students in their first and second years will already be confronted with customary law, so indigenous African law, and this will be a kind of an apex module where what happens in property law, family law, and so on is summarized in this module. And then also a course in research methodology and a compulsory research paper in the final year, which will advance the idea of citizens, of students as also constructors of knowledge. Right, that's in brief.
All right. I think our story from EMS is a little different from law faculty. We are quite a big faculty with very different disciplines. So we have decided to approach the demands for decolonization in a different way. And what we have done as a first step is to look at the whole idea, the notion of decolonization. What does it entail? And we have had a discussion about that. So we are very clear in our minds as a faculty what the notion of decolonization is all about. And the next step is to respond to the call for decolonization, having understood the nuances about the notion and all that. So that's where we are. And my presentation is really to share with you our understanding of the broad spectrum of definitions or classifications or descriptions of decolonization, and then attempt to provide some ideas as to where do we go from here. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm looking at four things, but the most important aspect of the presentation is really about the notions of decolonization. And some academics have done scholarly work on this idea. So it's not necessarily new. There's considerable literature about decolonization, and we have been able to put together the key themes around the various notions. So I'm just going to go through the notions. So the first one is about decentering European knowledge. And we've been able to put together the key ideas that are related to this notion. And the first one is the call for a reconstruction of the curriculum content around the knowledge, values, and ideals of Africa and not Europe. Now, there is a liberal view around this that also calls for a displacement and not necessarily a deletion, I mean a removal of European values, ideas, and all that. Again, there's a strong argument within this notion that European ideals should be secondary to African ideals. And it's been argued that the notion that speaks to decentering is more or less a soft form of Africanization. So that's the first notion. The second one is the most popular one, Africanization of knowledge. And if you like, it's probably the most radical form. And here the argument is for a replacement of Western knowledge with a knowledge that is African. And that whole idea of Pan-African view is closely associated with this. So for instance, there's an argument that the curriculum should be about Africa and not Africa in relation to Europe or the distant West. And I'm sure we're all familiar of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the popular Kenyan literature academic, and he argues strongly for using African language even as a medium of communication and instruction at universities. That's really another extreme within the Africanization notion, if you like. The third one is what has been described as additive inclusive knowledge. Again, this is also seen as a soft version of decolonization. And the emphasis here is a call for an addition to the existing knowledge that addresses African ideals and values and all that. And in some instances, it has been seen as considering African knowledge as an appendage to the existing established knowledge. And I can give an example associated with this. So at the University of Ghana, where I had my first and second degrees, for the first year, students are required to take a course in African studies. So the African studies, there's drumming, there's drama, you need to learn one other indigenous language and all that. And I think but really beyond the first year, nobody even remembers what one did, in the first year. And I think that is what is being described here as an appendage to accommodate, Africanization in the form, but not necessarily taking it serious. Okay. The fourth one, which I like quite a bit, is critical engagement with settled knowledge. And it raises certain key questions. And I think the Dean from Law Faculty alluded to some of those issues in considering the way forward with the curriculum. The first one is to raise questions about the source of the knowledge in the first place. and then to ask whose interest